Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Carmine's Arena, a cultural gourmet of information, if you will, a feast for your mind and soul. And now, without further delay, the man, the myth, the maestro, Carmine Arena.
Greetings and welcome once again to Carmine's Arena, site of contest and conflict, venue for and of resolution. Resolution in terms of focus, remedy, and commitment, both yours and mine, to the preservation, the propagation, and indeed the celebration of Western civilization. Liberal professors, whose name is Legion, love to imagine that they speak the plain and simple truth. Truth to tell, however, is neither ever plain nor simple. Such academics remind me of Plato's observation that the wise speak when they have something to say. Fools speak merely to say something. Ignorance among the learned has launched an assault upon truth, a camouflaged attack that has been all too successful, thus occasioning a pandemic of infection by infectious fallacy. Fallacies going viral, mimicking the truth, and occupying the very sovereignty once wielded over and held by common sense and sensibility. That is to say, the capacity to respond perceptively to intellectual, moral, and/or aesthetic values. Such is always a delicate balance, a balance nonetheless which safeguards the immune system of logical thought, lest it suffers the penetration of sophistry, cant, bias, and political agenda, to name but a few of said types of viral insult, to quickly catapult for best results. Academia and the infotainment media are the sources of communicable ignorance and its feverish defense. A weak defense artfully posed as, well, axiomatic and lacking thereby the need, the energy, and/or ambition to engage in dialogue, discussion, or responsible repartee. Truth in these dirty hands becomes a prize with which to polarize, whereas the truth-seeker quests after truth to be scrutinized, temporized, and only afterward lionized, but never monopolized nor otherwise meant to ostracize. Beware of groupthink, whose self-praise begins to stink of fishy fallacy, born of obstinacy and professed by the airless advocacy of academic and epidemic lunacy, driving us all to the brink. One, for example, might do well to ask, will the real Uncle Tom please stand up? Those who use the reference of Uncle Tom to disparage their own kin do a disservice to the very character as portrayed by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The lack of fear for his own life and his willingness to stand up to the brutish slave master Simon Legree earned Tom the respected title of Uncle, a title reserved in those days for the most honorable male on any given plantation. Black slaves adopted Tom as their uncle and valiant intercessor between master and slave. It would be immediately helpful for those who use that term to willfully vilify, to sit down and to actually read this 1852 account. Like the similar character Kunta Kinte in Roots, No amount of oppression or cruelty could break his spirit. Much like Uncle Tom himself, who died a Christ-like martyr. Word spread from state to state in the novel after Tom challenged his new master to stop the cruelty exacted on field hands by the overseers. Tom's cabin became a place of refuge. He became a champion of the mistreated and eventually became the political opposition to the leaders. This was the real Uncle Tom. Ironically, his biggest enemies were those black overseers appointed as leaders over slaves. Little has changed, methinks. Kin bent on din and sin. Thus the character of Tom, portrayed as faithful and happily submissive, is a crock perpetuated by the illiterate who teach and profess a self-justified rage and hatred against those blacks who dare to think for themselves. In reality, the liberal black and white wish to keep their slavish mentality ever fixed and fixated on the plantation culture in order to reap the highly dubious advantages of official victimhood, advantages validated by the machinations of misidentified poverty. Life squandered, selfhood misspent by generations who are taught to wait for that first-of-the-month welfare check, along with its other perks guaranteed by well-honed race-hustling experts who caucus for unanimous groupthink raucous, and TV's gold dust from their talking head self-portraits. Whereas the civil rights movement fought and sought for integration, not the en bloc calcification, the ossification of thought leading to that aforesaid plantation. That plantation mentality as naught but predestination set apart for entitlement sports. The war on poverty, now many decades old, has cost in excess of some $20 trillion and still counting. 'Tis worth noting that as we as a nation have little patience for long wars, in fact, that is our greatest one weakness, unlike the patient endurance of our enemies. Nevertheless, the long, endless war on poverty has been a capital bust, a defeat by any standard, and yet we sing anthems and pledge blind allegiance to its continuance and sufferance. Why? Why, indeed? Well, the plantation needs a ready supply of that gimme block of voters. A depraved electorate politicians are ever ready to activate and alleviate, and yes, to satiate their unquenchable greed and mob screed, so thus to ameliorate this all too idle but voting jamboree, made lifelong refugees who are left to tote squeegees. But for the race hustlers, there's the guarantee of ghoulish glee, shored up by a sea of out-of-wedlock babies ever taught to loathe being scot-free save for predictable criminal sprees. These misguided types be the weebies here before you, and are going to be's here after you. The book to read is Muzzled by Juan Williams. Subtitle, The Assault on Honest Debate. Mr. Williams is certainly not a conservative, but has spoken out for years, God bless him, against the staggering, swaggering, blind hatred visited upon black conservatives by liberals who believe in diversity in all things but the diversity of thought and opinion. Most recently, Mr. Williams, a man of color, raged against Rutgers University initial stand on canceling Condoleezza Rice's invitation as commencement speaker. and when she was also to have received, where she was also have gotten an honorary degree. Dr. Rice, the first African-American woman to serve as National Security Advisor and the nation's Secretary of State, apparently doesn't have what it takes to be honored by Rutgers Faculty Council. Doesn't have what it takes, though she earned a Ph.D. in political science, has taught college for decades, was provost of Stanford University, working her way up from a working-class family in the segregated South, yet nonetheless reaching the highest echelon of world power and politics. Her truth is stranger than fiction, as is the truth attendant upon the celebrated black pediatric neurosurgeon of singular distinction, Benjamin Carson, who was forced to step down as commencement speaker for Johns Hopkins University, where he ably served as head of the neurosurgery department. Why? Why on earth? Well, he dares think for himself, dares to be a conservative. But Juan Williams, a longtime liberal, nevertheless despairs of the gross, senseless attacks liberals toss about to demean and dismiss brilliant black people like Rice, who also happens to be a classically trained pianist, who still gives concerts. Yes, demean and dismiss the aforementioned Rice, Dr. Benjamin Carson, and to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, U.S. Senator Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, Professor Walter E. Williams, and economist Thomas Sowell, all the above demeaned and dismissed because they don't fit into the role they have independently carved out for a black person in America. Whereas the Reverend race hustlers, who should be coming to their defense, sneer at these conservatives while holding their shabby correspondence course accreditation in theology. Thereafter to be called the Reverend this and the Reverend that, whereas they should be entitled the Revenue this and the hate spewer for revenue that. Juan Williams, whom I've been loosely paraphrasing, has admittedly experienced some of this vitriol firsthand when he dared to veer from liberal orthodoxy. He strongly advocated that Secretary Rice, though on the fence about a White House run, go for the nomination for no other reason than to rub it into the faces of these pompous jackass professors who don't believe that their graduates can think for themselves, much less invite Secretary Rice to an open forum debate to weigh their ignorance against her vast tolerance and insightful resonance. Of course, says Juan Williams, that is not the only reason for Rice to run, that is, to run out of pique or spite, but her running would be a delightful bonus, unquote. Thus, black Americans, as I've amply proven, must remain obedient to all things liberal or risk being called a race traitor or an Uncle Tom. But having earlier heard my discourse on the misuse of the Uncle Tom epithet, listen for it no longer with tin ears, but elevated ears which are not only ready to hear, but who have learned to listen. Listen, dare I say, musically. For in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Tom ends life in defiance of moral depravity, and I repeat is martyred a Christ-like figure. A figure who saw Christianity as the saving grace of the white man's race. And as the African-American Walter Rhett said, religion was neither forced on the slave or accepted naively. In fact, the widespread acceptance of Christ by the enslaved is the biggest conversion experience in the history of Christianity after the birth and death of Jesus. The earlier derided reverends who pretend to a Christian faith remind me of an observation by the great thinker G.K. Chesterton, who noteth that Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. It has been tried and found difficult, and so has been left untried. 'Twould appear race-hustling reverends revere only themselves, I fear. I ask you now, though I literally begged you in the past, to learn to listen with musical ears, and then it is that ye shall know the truth. Think how those slaves their human spirit cried out in music. They were permitted to make on Sundays. Theirs an everyday, everyone's day of rest. Rest for reflection, both for whites and blacks. The latter created a body of work we call spirituals, reflective of hope and profound belief in a Savior. These incomparable spirituals carry subtle messages which had been, if they'd been spoken, would have gotten them whipped, but sung. The beauty of their aesthetic coupled with the resonance of the voice was irresistible. Ah, yes, about that voice, the human voice, that inimitable instrument, which still remains a mystery to science, a magic for our ears, a miracle embracing all mankind. Listen to these lyrics. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. They worked so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. This spiritual is overwhelming in its simplicity and in its subtle power, generously recognizing the Jews in earlier bondage who were divinely delivered unto the promised land. Yes, think and listen musically. Don't merely hear, but listen. Listen and absorb what gospel and blues suggest of our God-given innate longing, our longing to be free, our Western civilization's Judeo-Christian inextinguishable collective characteristic, which, when disobeyed, is always later punished vigorously unto defeat and just humiliation. Moving on, think of the marriage of African rhythms and European melody. And what does that engender but the legal tender of jazz, that genre which felt the white man's cold draft and warmed itself by the hot beauty of sound, valued sound spent to be improvised by each individual musician, in turn giving individual voice to their longing for self and selfhood. Uncle Tom would have danced around every square inch of his cabin. Yes, this jazz, beloved the world over, is nevertheless and nonetheless, despite its ad-lib improvised nature, remains solidly based on strict harmonic structure, which includes runs, riffs, and spiky chords, respectful of what has come before and to come after. Each soloist in his turn reveals his very own self-expression. How different this from the tin-eared noise and disorder, from group think, visited on self-realization, mindless of jazz, making and or jazz listening. Light years apart from, say, old Alcatraz dissing and race betas, bling-bling bizzazz. Bizzazz via rap-raps, claptrap, razzmatazz. And so we've gone from exaltations to a search and a perch on reparation. Excuse me. A perch on reparation from womanhood to slutshood via Snoop Dogg to like rap hen coop monologues from demagogues. So much for Snoop and rap's other war-whooping nincompoops who'd refuse, abuse, and accuse my dialogue as having gone too far. I ask, have we evolved or devolved? Louis Armstrong used to sing the plea, "What did I do to be so black and blue?" Would that rap's so-called artists could reach Armstrong's pinnacle, now long overdue. Louis Armstrong made poetry of being invisible. In very fact, as he well knew, music shapes the invisible because it possesses the elements to sound a theme forward, backward, upside down and backwards. Meaning is trapped and thus ever present to more than hear if but one listens. Significantly, Armstrong transcended his precursors in jazz, taking it from a movement of folklore to high modernism. He transmuted pain into poetry, unlike rap's "Don't Ray Me for Money." Fixing filth unto perfidy, stirred in a medley for female yummies, fully perceived as nothing more than busty dummies. How far from Armstrong have we fallen? Yes, I'll tell you. From Armstrong to all wrong. You see why musical ear is key to unlocking truth spoken or sung all too often with overly sweetened to sickening cheap vermouth. The hearing ear gets used to the tasteless noise. The listening one is far better poised for the elegant tastes of synesthetic equipoise. Rap rather longs for the ghetto stiletto gutter, that urban plantation of illogical clutter. Once in the gutter, it thirsts for the sewer, free of the curbs this reviewer has sought and continues to seek to verbally skewer. The co-opted musical truth and its sickening cheap vermouth will always share a half-empty glass. I search truth with an elitist, cultivated couth, which prefers to share a glass not half empty, but half full, longing for a quality brew, not being of that sum of scrappy, hapless victimhood, bedimmed by the seduction and reductions of political spin and pessimism's whim, sorrow's disguise to skim, so unlike spiritual's voice to hymn freedom's anthems, gospel music to serve as freedom's solemn emblems, and jazz itself freedom roundly begems, and diadems sans iconoclasm. But just you wait when economic realities turn liberals themselves into the fish-shaking, gainfully employed chumps, invaded of wallet and bruised from nickel and dime buffet by the impoverished, overjoyed lumps, those roughly made droids of anything even humanoid. The government plantations sustaining these tabloid droids devoid of all but tin-eared noise. Droids who'd rather snap, clap, rap, and catnap. The American dream, hollow-reamed by these and by all too many, even those slightly annoyed. Movie celluloid coy. Nevertheless, remain buoyed. We'll be their killjoy, no longer their errand boy. When our ship comes in, 'twill be with a convoy. Ahoy! Now hear and listen to this, an historic account you'll never receive firsthand from second-hand professors of the liberal brand who lie to you for your benefit, telling you not what is or what was, but tales of what they will it to be. This makes the lies about Uncle Tom even more poignant. In this, my postlude, a postlude being a musical selection that concludes a performance, in this case, a verbal performance, to be musically tested as I earlier requested, seriously and critically listening to false notes. America's first slave owner, just listen to this, was a black man. Yes, the first slave owner was a black man. Prior to 1655, there were no legal slaves in the colonies, only indentured servants. All masters were required to free their servants after 7 years. Upon release, they were granted 50 acres of land. Blacks, too, upon indentured release, were granted 50 acres. Now, please pay attention. Here's where slavery's sad tale is seized by its tail. There was an Anthony Johnson, a black man once indentured, who in 1651 held 250 acres and owned 5 black indentured servants. In 1654, it was time legally to release one John Cassor, one of said 5 black servants. Instead, Anthony Johnson told Cassor he was extending his time. Cassor ignored him, left, and became employed by a free white man, Robert Parker. Anthony sued Mr. Parker in the Northampton court in 1654. And in 1655, the court ruled as often as they misruled. The court ruled that Anthony Johnson could hold Cassor indefinitely. Thus, the court gave its judicial sanction for blacks to own slaves of their own race, and thus John Cassor became the very first permanent slave and Johnson's America's first slave owner. Wow, how our human species plows on, being too complex and contrarian for the likes of liberal professors who only pretend to tell the plain and simple truth, ignoring the black and white fact that the truth, as I vow, is never plain nor ever simple. Those professors themselves are often simple, however plainly dimpled or wrinkled, and tin-eared minstreled. To learn more, Google blacks who own blacks. 'Tis an interesting flashback you'll rarely find in academic book stacks, nor let alone among the traffickers of race-hustling kickbacks. Well, folks, 'tis well time to now cease to academics perplex and pseudo-theologians roll over. I ask you now to remember, to preserve, propagate, and celebrate Western civilization. Remember what I said to you, especially about Uncle Tom and conservative blacks, and keep the faith.
If you have any comments or other remarks, and that I perhaps could even read on some of these broadcasts, please do not hesitate to write to me, Carmine Arena, P.O. Box 1029, Larchmont, New York 10538.